Okay, let's start. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Raby. I'm the Assistant Director of Missions at Berklee. Thank you for joining our songwriting and production remote session today. This is a session produced by Berklee's Global Enrollment Initiatives. Berklee's Global Enrollment Initiatives explores, develops, and manages partnerships and events around the world to discover talent and design educational and cultural engagement opportunities for Berklee's global community. Today's session features guest speaker, Berklee's Assistant Professor, Thavius Beck. As a multi-instrumentalist producer, MC, and electronic music educator, Thavius Beck is a man whose life revolves around music and technology, with a focus on bass-heavy rhythms, dark emotional melodies, and twisted sample manipulation. He has not only released numerous albums of his own, both as Thavius Beck and under his previous moniker, Adlib. He has also collaborated with or remixed artists such as Saul Williams, 9 Inch Nails, the Mars Volta, Skylar Grey, and Nas, just to name a few. He is also a certified Ableton Live trainer and one of the most recognizable faces and voices worldwide for Ableton Live education. I hope everyone can learn something today. Let's welcome Thavius Beck.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate the very warm introduction, and hello to all of you. I see that there's people joining from various parts of the world, so thank you for making yourselves available and showing some interest in this initiative here. Over the course of the next hour, what I'd like to do is discuss some of the ways that I approach songwriting and production, specifically for the things that I've done and for the things that I try to prepare students for. Ultimately, there's many ways to utilize your knowledge in terms of making music. But it's not just about releasing albums, all right? There's a lot of opportunities in terms of getting your music licensed for visual media, doing sound effects, doing Foley work, doing live installation, doing music for, actual physical media. So there's a lot of different ways to approach it. And a big part of understanding how to take advantage of that is being flexible with your tools and understanding how to be able to make the software a bit more tangible, a bit more like an instrument, all right? So what I like to do, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen really quickly. And if there's any questions that pop up, feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them a little bit later. Let me go ahead and share my screen, make sure I have stereo sound. And as was mentioned in the wonderful introduction, I am an Ableton certified trainer. And when it comes to producing and performing, Ableton Live has been one of my main tools for many, many years. It's by no means the only thing that I use. There's another DAW called Bitwig that I like quite a bit. And I have a lot of hardware that I end up using a lot. But the main reason I'm bringing this up is because in terms of having the most flexibility for producing and then using the same tool to perform live, Ableton Live is great for that. I'm currently based in Berklee, NYC. I was teaching at both campuses and now I'm full-time at Berklee, NYC. That is a graduate program, a master's program. It's a one-year intensive, and in that program, we're primarily focusing on students creating a body of work. So the focus is really on utilizing these tools to figure out your own sound and figure out what you specifically want to do, not what a professor's telling you to do, all right? So with that little introduction and setup, I'm going to start from kind of the end point and then work my way backwards. What I've opened up here, this is a show set that I put together for an artist named Saul Williams. He's one of the people who was mentioned earlier, spoken word artist, poet, actor, musician. He does a lot of stuff. And for many years, I functioned as his one-man band and was able to do that using Ableton Live. This is a show set, one of many different show sets that I put together for Saul Williams. And if you're not familiar with Ableton Live, the way that this is currently set up, this is a screen that's called the session view. When you open up this program, this is the first thing that you see. If you're not an Ableton Live user, this may look pretty unfamiliar, but this opens up a lot of flexibility, and this is where the live aspect of Ableton Live really comes into play. The way this show set is set up, and again, I'm getting into this because you don't have to use this to perform, but to be able to use the same program to do both is pretty powerful. All right. In this setup here, each one of these horizontal rows, these are called scenes, and each scene is set up to play different stems from different songs. All right, so if we look here, this is something that I'll play. This is actually a track that I made that's an intro for the set. There's 2 stems here. We can see each one of these vertical columns is a track, and there's stems that have been exported and put together to play in sync. Now, each one of these scenes also has a tempo that's set. So when I launch this, it'll play these specific clips. Any other clips will stop. Things will launch at the proper tempo, so all my tempo-based effects will work properly. And I had this set up so if I click this MIDI button, various parameters were MIDI mapped, so I don't have to use my mouse and sit here and look like I'm, on Facebook or something. I can use my MIDI controller, make it much more tactile, make it really feel like a performance. All right. So just a quick example, if I play this is a beat that I actually made in Ableton Live, exported stems and then brought it in for the show set. So let's just get an example of what this sounds like. Okay, and then it goes and it goes and it does its thing, right? And I can play with effects and add reverb and delay and filters and whatnot in real time, which is great. Now, the one thing about this that makes it so flexible and powerful is that for this particular show set, there's a bunch of different songs that are loaded up in these different scenes. Some of these are broken into various sections so that we can jump to different parts when we want to. But the most important thing is that this gives us the flexibility of not having the same set list or the same show list every single night. We can play any different combination of songs in any order that we want. Everything will always be in sync, and it's very easy to control. So getting to this point is a matter of having enough content, right? Enough songs where you can put together a set and be able to entertain people for an hour or so at a time. So let's step all the way back. I'm going to go ahead and create a new set here. And just to be clear, if you end up at Berklee, you won't just be using Ableton Live, you'll be using a wide variety of tools, especially if you're in the undergrad campus at Berklee, Boston. But like I said, Ableton Live is a great tool to understand and use because it's really the industry standard when it comes to live performance, and it's very flexible when it comes to production. So in terms of starting, right, figuring out, okay, how can I develop enough songs, enough sounds to come up with some sort of live performance? I think the big part is identifying what your own sound is, right? People come to Berklee because they want to make music. And ideally, you want to make music because you have a passion and a desire to express something. And if that's the case, you probably want to express something that's unique and dear to you based on your own experiences, things that you've heard, things that have influenced you and whatnot. So it's really important to be able to figure out, okay, what is my sound, right? Not just in terms of instruments and whatnot that you like to use, but in terms of certain sonic characteristics. Do you like things that are more quote unquote warm? Do you like fuzzy distortion? Do you like things that are very clean? Do you like more of a lo-fi sound? Do you like things that are very wide and atmospheric? Do you like things that are more industrial and aggressive, more up-tempo, down-tempo? Do you like more swing, quantization? Understanding these things is really important because it helps you make things more efficiently. It's all about getting the ideas out of your head and into whatever DAW or program that you're using quickly. Let me just see, I see someone popped in the chat. What would be the setup for playing live? Do you use things like the APC 40 to launch clips? Okay, this is a really good question. And I'll jump into this really quickly. For the set that I just had up, the controller that I was primarily using was either Ableton Push or a Launchpad. I've also used, there's a controller, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. There's a company that's no longer in business that's called Livid. And they had a controller called Bass, B-A-S-E. And it's got 32 pads and it's got 8 touch strips. And I would also use that to control the set. Really, really flexible, very fun controller. But ultimately, you know, the main thing for controlling a live set is, do you want knobs and faders to control effects and volume? Or do you want the ability to play instruments live? Or are you trying to do both, right? That's the main thing that would inform my decision. So yeah, it's a good question. All right, so let's keep it going. Okay, so here I am. I got a brand new set. And the whole idea is trying to think about, okay, what sort of sound do I want to create? What direction do I want to go in? For me personally, again, as my intro said, and as you might see in my bio, I like to work with samples. I like to manipulate audio that I find. I like to twist it, slice it, filter it, reverse it, do weird things, and create different textures from that. So generally where I like to start is by grabbing some sounds and manipulating, all right? In Ableton Live, this is really, really easy to do. And we'll look at a few different examples here. And I just want to make it clear, even though this is the DAW that I'm using, I want to approach all the stuff conceptually, all right? You can use more than just Ableton Live to manipulate samples. This just happens to be the tool that I'm most comfortable with, all right? So as a quick example, I'm going to go into the samples here. And this is a work computer, so it doesn't have all my personal files. I'm just going to find a quick drum loop from Ableton Live's library. Okay, sure, why not? And I'm going to take this drum loop and drop it into an audio track. I now have this audio clip. And the way that Ableton Live works, all the audio that you bring in will be automatically warped. It'll automatically be time stretched so that it'll follow the tempo of your project. Now, this can be really useful, especially if you're into manipulating audio in some interesting ways. And I think that's what I'd like to do. So one fun thing that's a good challenge that also kind of influences the sound that I personally come up with is seeing how much I can do with one sample, all right? A good example would be, okay, this is a drum loop. There's nothing melodic in here, but could I turn this into something that has drums and maybe a bass and a melody just by using sounds from this one sample? Let's see, all right? First thing I will do is I want to slice this up because I don't want to use this pattern the way that it currently is. It's also playing at half the speed, but that's okay. Like I said, I don't want to use this as an audio loop. One big thing about using samples is that if your samples are untreated and not manipulated, it doesn't really feel like you did much. You're almost working more like a collage artist, okay? I want to make sure I put my effect on these sounds. So one easy thing that I could do is I could take this sample and I could slice it. I could cut it into smaller pieces, and there's a few different approaches I can use to accomplish this. I have an instrument that I can use called Simpler. If I go into my instruments here, the Simpler instrument allows me to play back samples chromatically, or I can slice them. So I'm going to put this instrument on a MIDI track, drop in my audio sample, and now this is inside of my Simpler on track 1. All right. If I arm the track right now, if I start to play this, I'll be able to play it at different pitches. All right, but that's not really what I want to do. What I'd rather do is I want to slice this. So while I'm looking over here in my Simpler instrument on the left side, there's a slice button. If I click on this, it's going to automatically slice the audio. Right now, it's slicing it based on transients. All right, whenever there's a sharp change in the volume, a quick volume attack, volume spike, it's creating a slice. For drums, that's actually pretty convenient. And with this track armed, all right, so now we got some slices. All right, it's always weird kind of playing in real time with Zoom because there's a bit of latency here. That's my excuse. But let's go ahead. I'm going to record, create a little drum beat here using my slices. And once we have this stuff sliced, there's more things that we can do to manipulate the audio to change it even further. And like I said, I want to create a few different layers using this one loop and just see how far I can get by taking this sample and changing it into different sound sources. Okay, this is a great way to think about production and to come up with sounds that are unique. All right, so with that said, let's see. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start recording into a clip and wish me luck. All right, let's go in here. Need to quantize this, obviously, so let's go ahead and all right, so I have a hi-hat sample here. I think it's here. Where's it at? There we go. All right, and what is my grid set to 64th notes? I'm going to change the size of this grid, and I'm going to just draw in some notes here, make it a little bit easier for things to actually be in sync. And inside of this clip, now that I have these notes, I want to make sure that only one sound plays at a time. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and deactivate some of these notes. I'll deactivate the hi-hat by just selecting the notes in here and pressing 0 for the ones I don't want to play. All right, cool. And I think for this last little hi-hat sample, I'd like this to play twice in this space. It's a 16th note long. What we can do is with this note selected, I'll go over to the left to my clip properties. With the MIDI notes, I have a note tab here, and I can divide the note length by 2. And then I can simply duplicate the note. Oops, that duplicates the whole clip. I hit the wrong button. The note selected, I'll use Command D. There we go. And now, and actually, it might be a good idea to take this 1-bar loop, and let's go ahead and duplicate the whole thing. So now we have a 2-bar loop. And in the first bar, let's just leave that last hi-hat a 16th note. So now we have a 2-bar pattern with just a slight variation at the end. Okay, cool. Before I leave here, if I want to have a bit more variation with this drum pattern, having the same loop consistently going will get kind of boring. Another great thing with Ableton Live, especially in this session view in particular, is you're not stuck with a particular arrangement, all right? On this track, I have my MIDI instrument, and I have various clips where I can have different notes play different patterns. All these clip slots can have a different clip, which can be different lengths, and I can trigger these whenever I want. And every time I trigger a clip, it's going to start at the beginning of the next bar. This is a big reason why this is so good for live performance. You have a lot of flexibility, a lot of variety, but things will always stay locked to the grid if that's what you choose to do. So with that said, I'm going to take this clip and I will duplicate this, Command D. And let's make it so that this version of the clip will not have the hi-hats in it. So I can just go here. Instead of selecting all the individual notes for the hi-hat, I can just click on the note lane here, which will select all of them. And like I said, I can press 0 to deactivate everything. For those of you who are new to Ableton Live, if you're following this and want to get more into doing what I'm doing, all the shortcuts that I'm mentioning, you can access just by right-clicking and you'll see those things there. All right, activate is 0, deactivate is the same thing. Okay, so I have, based on wanting to just use a sample to manipulate something, I have a little drum idea, and this can be a good foundation for me to get inspired. And now I want to take this same sample and try to make something melodic out of it. All right. What I'm getting into right now is the idea of sound design, because sound design is a really important aspect of figuring out who you are as a musician and bringing something unique to the world of electronic music. All right. So one thing, in fact, that I'll just mention, a big thing I try to hammer home to my students is getting them to rely less on presets and stock samples. Doesn't mean that you can't use those, doesn't mean that they're against the rules or something like that. But oftentimes people will be looking for something that they can easily create or have something that they can easily modify to get to what they want. All right, so understanding what you're hearing, what you like, and how you can translate that into action is important. Okay, now let's go ahead. I have another MIDI track here, and I want to do something a little bit different with this drum sample. I'd like to create a very tiny loop out of this and try to turn this into some sort of melodic sound. All right. So to do this, I'm going to use a different instrument. In Ableton Live, going into my instruments. And conceptually, all I want to do is just take an audio sample. And I want to treat this audio sample more like an oscillator. All right. What does that really mean? Well, let's go ahead and look at a synth really quickly so we can understand what I'm talking about. Let's see. Yeah, analog will be a good example. Okay. So analog is a subtractive synthesizer. All right. And the sounds here aren't generated from samples. They're generated from an oscillator. The oscillator has a certain waveform, a certain wave shape, and we're oscillating, cycling through this shape a certain number of times per second. The number of wave cycles per second determines the pitch. All right. The whole idea is that if you look at these different shapes, these are also known as single cycle waveforms. And if we take an audio sample and we create a small enough loop, we can loop something that may not have the same exact shape, but it can function in a similar way. All right, that's what I want to do. So let's get rid of analog. And I'm going to bring in a different instrument. This instrument is called sampler. This is a bit more advanced than simpler. We can load multiple samples. We can place them in various key zones, make them only get triggered by certain velocities. We can get pretty deep, all right? But I'm not going to go that far. All I want to do is take the same drum loop, and I'm going to drag and drop it into this instrument. And I just want to try to create something that sounds more like a tone, okay? So if I play this, let me see, is my keyboard on? Yes, it is. All right, so just like I did with simpler, initially, when I drop a sample in here, I can play it at different pitches. Okay, not all that exciting. What I want to do instead is create a very small loop, all right? In this instrument, if I want to make a loop, this is called the sustain mode. I'm going to create a forward loop. And now everything highlighted in blue is my loop. And I want to make a very small loop. Very, very, very small. And when I say small, I mean really, really small. Okay. All right, that's kind of interesting. I'm going to move this small loop through the sample to see if I can get a bit more of an interesting sort of character. All right. But if we zoom in here, you can see the shape. It's not a super complicated shape. It's not a very long piece of the sample. It's kind of like a single cycle waveform. I'm able to turn any sample into something that's more like a synth. All right, now I don't want it to start here at the kick, so I'm going to move my start point right there at the beginning of the loop. Let's zoom in some. All right, now that's pretty noisy. It's kind of grating. I don't know that I want it to be this bright, but again, I'm using this as a starting point. All right, this is a sample-based instrument, but I can run these samples through a filter, and that would probably be pretty helpful to get rid of some of the stuff I don't want. There's a few other things that I could do here that might make this even more interesting. And since I'm into making things interesting, I'm going to go a little further with this. Before I continue, though, this loop, I think it's okay now, but I might want to increase the crossfade so the end and the beginning of the loop fade into each other. And if I play this an octave or two lower, all right. So let's go to our filter here. Our little loop from the sample is going to be fed through the filter, and I want this to be able to sit on top of the drums, but maybe be a lower synth sort of texture. All right, I don't want a bright lead. I want something a little bit lower in frequency. So I think what I'm going to do with my filter on here, I'm going to change this to a bandpass filter, which will cut the lows and the high frequencies and just keep everything in the middle. And if I can get some movement like that happening, I think that'd be pretty cool. All right. So again, getting into sound design. Now, why am I even thinking like this? Well, because a lot of music that I listen to, I hear modulation, I hear movement, I hear variation, and things like using envelopes and LFOs or automation are great ways to introduce that movement and that modulation. But what things are being modulated? What things are changing, right? That's when you have to listen and really focus on what it is that you like. I like music with a lot of bass, and I like when frequencies are manipulated and cut, all right? To cut frequencies from a sound, a filter is a really, really good way to do that, but not just leaving it like that, having some movement, some modulation. Okay, so with all that said, I like this sound, but I need some movement here. If I want to change the filter frequency or have this change as I play a note, I could use a modulation source. I could use something like an envelope, or I could use, if I go to this modulation tab, I have numerous LFOs here, and I have this other envelope that I could assign to the filter. A lot of things I can do. To keep this simple, I'm going to go ahead and I'll turn on LFO 2. This is a low frequency oscillator, and this is just going to modulate or change the value of whatever I assign this to. If If I go down here, I have two different destinations, two different places that I can assign this LFO to, and I want to modulate the filter frequency. So if I click here, let's look at my long list, filter frequency. All right. How much will the LFO affect the filter frequency? That's here. Okay, that's pretty cool. We could sync this to the tempo. I'm going to change the rate here, and let's sync this to the tempo. Let's go for maybe quarter notes. And this is something that we could automate or change over time if we want. But let's just hear how this sounds with the drums. I'll go to my second scene. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and record that. And after the clip is recorded, then we can do some more fun stuff to manipulate this and add another layer. Okay. Now, the whole reason I'm going into it this way is because a lot of times, for me anyway, I may not have an initial idea in terms of where I want to start, but I know that there's things I can do that are going to inspire me and that are going to keep the momentum going. And as long as I don't get stuck or overthink the process, I'm going to end up somewhere pretty cool or end up with some material that I can salvage and use for another project. So that's what this whole process is about. Before I record, since the last thing I did was so horribly offbeat, I'm going to enable some record quantization here. Please don't judge me. Let's set this to 16th notes. And I think that should be all right. So let's launch this scene. And when I'm ready, I'll start to record. All right, and yeah, my timing must be quite late. Again, I blame Zoom. Everyone watching, I blame Zoom. Okay, let's do that. Let's do that. I think that should be okay. Okay. All right, that's great. Okay. Now, doing something like this, this sound is quite dry. The drums that I sliced up are kind of like, you know, alone and sort of on an island. And there's ways that I can play around with processing these elements. All right. And I'll probably get to that in a second. But before I do, this modulation here is pretty cool and I like it, but I could take it even further. And something that's commonly done, especially if you use an LFO to modulate a filter, would be to play around with the sync rate of the filter. And I could do this, again, either by automating this, which I haven't done any sort of automation yet, or I could use another LFO to modulate this one, all right? But yeah, I use an LFO already. So let's go ahead and let's look at doing some automation, all right? The notes that I played are inside of this clip. I should get the chat out of the way. There we go. The notes that I played are inside of this clip, all right? And if I want to do some automation, I can draw automation within this clip that is the exact same length as this clip, in this case, it's a 4-bar clip, or I can make my automation longer or shorter depending on what I'm going for, all right? To do this, I can utilize what's called a clip envelope, all right? And Ableton Live clip envelopes are basically a place for you to do automation inside of a clip. If I copy and paste that clip, the clip envelope moves with it, all right? If I want to do that, let's go down here. Here's my clip envelope. Okay. So looking at this, envelopes allow us to change things over time. All right. So when we talk about an envelope inside of the clip, it's another way for us to refer to automation in this case. What I want to automate or modulate is the sync rate of the LFO. Let's go over here. This is what I want to change. All right. The easiest way for me to approach this is if I go to my clip and I see that the clip envelope is visible, I could try to click and find the specific thing that I want to change, but that might be kind of difficult looking at this big list. So the easy way to do this is just simply go to the parameter that you want to change, modulate, and just click on it. And then when you go back to the clip envelope, that will be the thing that's selected. All right. So right now, this is set to LFO2 sync rate. The sync rate is set to some sort of note value because it's synced to my tempo. So now what I could do is I can easily automate these changes, and I can make these changes snap to the grid. All right. If I want to draw automation, the default setting would be to use my mouse, and I can click and put breakpoints. But doing a slope with this doesn't really make a lot of sense because there's not like 128 values I can smoothly go between. There's, a limited amount of values I can choose, and it's going to jump from one to the other. So what I would rather do, instead of making slopes, is I'm going to use my pencil tool. Go to the upper right corner and I can click on this icon. And by using my pencil tool, I can draw automation that just snaps to the grid. All right. So I'll do this in real time as it plays. And I think I want to make it so that my grid is set to something, maybe quarter notes, something like that. So then when I draw my automation, it'll snap to a quarter note grid. All right, let's play the clip and let's see where we end up after we automate the sync rate. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. That's kind of cool. Now, at this point, I can keep playing around with the sound and do more, but I think I'd like to move on to another texture. Although, since we're talking about playing with the filter, a couple more things I can do to give this even more grit and texture. In this sampler instrument, which is very cool, it's kind of complicated, hasn't been updated in a while, but it's super flexible. This is one of my favorite instruments in Ableton Live. In this filter area, there is a distortion circuit, overdrive circuit, and you also have a wave shaper here. And these both can be used to really drive the filter and give the sound more texture. Again, this came from a loop from the drum sample, right? But no one's going to know unless they see this video. So let's go back to the filter. The circuit. Okay, that's a significant difference. We have drive. Oh, yeah, that's when I change this from clean to this particular circuit, the drive parameter got enabled. Adding all that drive really emphasizes and pushes the sound forward. All right. I have a wave shaper here as well. Okay. Now, again, all these things are in this instrument in Ableton Live. This doesn't mean you couldn't approach this a similar way in a different DAW or even with hardware, as long as you have the right effects chain. Okay. I'm just overdriving the signal from the filter. And this is giving me that more warm, kind of aggressive sort of tone. I'm going to enable this wave shaper as well. And again, I just want to get this, I'm trying to add character. All right. Okay, cool. That works for now. All right. So that's one melodic texture that we got from these drums. We'll just call this like wobbly, low synth. We got some sliced drums over here. That's great. I want to add one more little texture from these drums and then talk about the idea of trying to process and sort of organize and arrange this stuff. Okay. But as I mentioned, starting with the idea of having a full show set, all these different songs, all this different material, it all has to start from someplace. And it doesn't automatically start with you just making stuff. It starts with you having inspiration, having an idea, and some sort of path forward based on knowing what you like and how to create the things you like, right? So it really starts with listening with more intention. focusing on the music that you like and asking yourself, what specifically is it that I like here? And pulling those different combinations and making something interesting. A lot of the music that I make is a mixture of a lot of different genres. I grew up, was born in 1979, so I grew up in the golden age of hip hop. I was also very heavily influenced by progressive rock, jazz, fusion, a little bit of metal here and there, all over the place, right? So I try to bring all those things together with what I make and the approaches with my sound. But anyway, let's keep going. I'm going to create one more MIDI track here, Shift Command T. And I want to create one more texture out of the sound, and then from there talk about processing this stuff a bit. And then I think we'll be ready for some questions. So, all right, getting back into the instruments. Like I said, I play around with samples a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring this simpler instrument back in, but we're going to use this differently. Instead of slicing the drum sample, I want to go for something similar to what I did with the sampler here. I want to make something a bit more melodic, but I want to go for more of a plucked type of sound. So the idea will be similar. I want to make a very small loop, but then I also want to play around with the amplitude envelope, with the volume over time. All right, understanding how to shape certain things like the amplitude envelope, a filter envelope, using LFOs gives you a ton of control in terms of developing your own sound. All right, so here we are. Okay, so once again, I want to create a little loop here, and in the simpler instrument, the controls are very different, and creating a effective loop is a little, it's just different. I'll put it that way. All right, here are the loop parameters, and I need to turn loop on. And I want to create a small loop once again. And I'm not even going to bother trying to explain the logic behind these settings because it's just weird. But I do want to move my loop, turn snap off so I can make my loop even smaller. And let's see, loop length. It's so weird. And okay, you know what? I might approach this a little bit differently. I have an idea. This is something I wasn't thinking about doing, but it'll be cool to show because this is another approach that might be a bit more effective. This drum clip is an audio clip, and I've been throwing this into MIDI instruments that allow me to play back samples. Oh, and there's another cool instrument called the granulator. That would be cool to show too, but I'm going to do this instead. Okay. In Ableton Live, as I mentioned, when we play these different clips, they're all going to start at the beginning of the next bar. All right, that's the way that this works. We can change that on a per clip basis or on a global basis up here. All right. Now, let's say that you want to take an audio clip and you want to take advantage of the fact that it's warped. Just to show you what I mean by that, let's go ahead and play this all together. All right, so as I change the pitch, it's going to stay locked to the project tempo, which is great. All right. And maybe what I want to do is I want to treat this clip more like an instrument that I can play. And there's actually ways that we can approach this. This is a little bit outside the box, but since we're talking about, developing your own sound, creative approaches, why not? What I'm going to do here is create a very small loop with this, and I'm going to MIDI map this clip so that I can play it at different pitches like an instrument. And this is going to give me a few different advantages over what I did in the simpler, which I will discuss shortly. So let's go ahead and I want to stretch this sample. So again, this is audio. Let's go ahead and solo this. All right. So this is currently, how long is this? This is what, a 16th note, I think. I'm going to take this audio here and I'm going to multiply the tempo of it by 2. We're going to stretch it. stretch it even further. Okay, that's as much as I can get away with here. All right, now I'm going to use this warp mode. I'm going to use this clip, and I'm going to use some settings with this warp mode to get this to do some interesting rhythmic stuff. And then I want to be able to play this clip at different pitches. All right. So this is, again, this is not like a typical technique that I would teach, but this is something that I play around with and do because it's a unique feature that leads me to different places. The idea of doing something like this and then resampling the output can lead you to even more creative places, but that's for another time. Okay. The audio is being warped, which means that we can change the pitch without changing the tempo and vice versa. There's various warp modes that determine how the audio is being time stretched, right? And you can use these the right way, and you can also use these the wrong way, all right? Let me show you what I'm talking about. The beats warp mode right here, I can use this to either make the audio play back smoothly as it's being stretched, or I can use techniques where I can make the audio sound like it's being chopped up or gated into certain rhythmic intervals. And I think that would be kind of interesting here. So let's do this. This track is soloed. Here's the beats warp mode. I'm in this audio tab, and we're going to do some things over here to change how this audio plays back. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to transpose this up quite high just to give this more of an obvious sort of like tone or pitch. And it'll also help with what I'm going to do as far as warping. Okay. The beats warp mode. Right now, this is set to preserve the timing of the transients, and it creates a little loop in between those transients. A transient, again, is basically anytime there's a big volume spike or a quick attack in the audio. Now, I don't care about making this playback smoothly. Actually, I want to hear rhythmic gaps in the audio because I think that'd be kind of cool. So there's a few different ways I can approach this. With the beats warp mode, under where it says preserve, I can set different rhythmic intervals, and I can make it so that it doesn't create a loop in between those different rhythmic intervals. So let me do this, and hopefully this will all make sense if you're not already aware of this. Let's do 16th notes. Okay. Now, what I've just done is I made it so that every 16th note, this beats warp mode is going to play back the audio. And here, I've set it so that it's not going to loop the audio in between every 16th note. The whole reason that this is working is because I've transposed the audio up so high, but I haven't changed the tempo. So it's got to stretch the audio to make it sound like it's playing continuously. With no loop, we don't really hear anything in terms of pitch. So I'm going to turn one of these loops back on. There's a forward loop or an alternating loop. Let's go with this forward loop. With this, there we go. So with this, I can keep that loop so I can hear that little tone, all right? Just like we looped the audio before, small enough loop, it almost functions like an oscillator, like we're using this like a synth. By having that small loop, but fading the end of it, I can get that rhythmic feel, all right? And I don't know if this is going to be in tune with my synth over here, and that's probably why it'll be nice to be able to transpose this in real time, all right? We'll get to that in a second. First, let's just hear this with the drums. I'm just curious what this sounds like rhythmically, and then I'll bring in the synth. I'm going to take this, let's duplicate that so it's in this scene. I see someone has just put something in the chat. Hey, Bruno, while manipulating drums as melodies, do you always recommend to use beats while warp is activated? It depends on what you're going for. That's a really, really good question. The main reason I'm using the beats warp mode is specifically because of what it lets me do rhythmically, all right? By transposing this up really high and having this loop mode activated, we can hear the pitch, right, of these individual loops. And I like that tone for this specific example, all right? But before I continue, let me just give you a different example. Let's go ahead and take this, and I'll drop this into track 5. And let's say instead of using the beats warp mode, we try a different warp mode. Let's say we try something like maybe complex, all right? So it's the same sample. Now, see, the thing is, I wouldn't even have thought to do this without reading your question. And this is not something I would use melodically, but I love the tone of this hi-hat that low using complex. It almost sounds like it's got this very metallic, it's like a knife in the kitchen, like scraping a metal cutting board or something, you know, it's really cool. So this could be another effective texture to use from these drums. And it's a result of trying a different warp mode. So again, it depends on what you're going for specifically. But I would just say experiment. Ultimately, this is my thing. There's no wrong answers when it comes to music. Music is completely subjective, unless it comes to, like, you know, analyzing a mix and things are just all over the place in terms of volume, or things are out of key and you meant to make things in key. But ultimately, it's all subjective, right? If someone makes a wall of noise, there's someone out there who's going to really enjoy that wall of noise. I know people who make noise music specifically, and, you know, that can be musical too. So all that to say, experiment and find the things that you like, right? In terms of playing with the warp modes, a lot of times the tones and texture warp modes get neglected because these are a lot older. But as far as sound design goes, in terms of warping things and kind of breaking the warp modes, using them incorrectly or whatever, these can lead you to really cool places too. All right, so hopefully that answers the question, and I'm glad that you asked. So I like this actually, and the last thing I wanted to talk about was like slightly processing this stuff. We only have a little bit of time left, so let me get there. All right. I wanted to talk about this clip here and MIDI mapping this to play it melodically. I don't know if many people realize you can MIDI map a range of notes to play audio clips. And this can be a fun way to play these chromatically and also still make it adhere to the clip launch quantization so it stays on beat. Here's an example. Let me move the zoom stuff out of the way. It's blocking the one button I want to hit. Okay. So I have MIDI mapping here. I happen to have a MIDI controller here. It's a bit of a quirky one. This is the circuit rhythm. This is a groove box, plays back samples, it can sequence. It's pretty fun. And it's also a pretty decent MIDI controller as well. So I'm going to map some notes on here to control this clip. If you have a MIDI controller and you want to do what I'm about to do, let me just make sure I show you. In the preferences here, I'm in the MIDI tab. My circuit rhythm is here. And when you want to MIDI map things to other tracks or different areas in Ableton Live, you have to make sure that the input, the MIDI input, has remote enabled. This will let me MIDI map the buttons and knobs to different things in Ableton Live that are not just on the track that's selected. Okay, here's the clip. I'm going to press MIDI. And in order to do this, if I want to just trigger this with one button, I could just press one button, but I want to trigger this with a range of notes. So I'm going to hold down the first note in the range. While I'm holding this, I'll press the last note in the range. All right. And if you look, it says that this has been mapped to MIDI channel 1 from C3 to C4. All those notes will trigger this clip. And that means that I can play this within an octave range. All right, let's get out of there. All right, I got concerned for a second. I was like, did Ableton Live freeze? Okay. So if I play this, the main thing is that when I play the different pitches, that's weird. Oh, there we go. Okay, so same clip, but I'm able to play it at different pitches. And yeah, I think there's like some funky clock stuff going on with my controller, but the point is that I can play that at different pitches. But the thing is that I can only make the clip start over every bar because that's what the clip launch quantization is set to. If I want to change it just for this clip, I can go over here and I can go into the launch area, which controls how often I can launch the clip and different ways it can be launched. So I want to set this up so the clip quantization, how often I can launch the clip, I want to be able to play it more often than every bar. Maybe I want to be able to trigger this, let's say, every 8th note. All right. It's so weird. All right, so now I could actually play rhythms with this. Maybe I could get those rhythms to fit with my wobbly bass up here. And yeah, there's not too much time left. So I'm going to just cover one last thing. All right. Getting closer to the idea of being able to have something I can throw into a show set. Let me just play this scene. Okay. This is, oh, you know what? Yeah, there's like different things mini mapped here. Okay, my controller's going crazy. With processing, okay, getting closer to being able to have this stuff inside of a show set means that we need to be able to make it sound the way that it should on a bigger system. And when it comes to working on like mixes and whatnot, I think oftentimes people kind of neglect the fact that working in your headphones is not going to give you the same sense of space, of how sound travels in a room as it will as if you're mixing stuff on actual monitor speakers in a better mixing environment. So one thing is it's good to be able to listen to your stuff in different sound systems, especially if you have a chance to listen on monitor speakers, do the car test, different things like that. But the flip side of that is that you need to make an effort to make sure that the frequencies in your song hit the way they're supposed to, based on how you want the music to be received, right? I spent many, many years playing in clubs all over the world. And the type of clubs that I played in really needed to focus on having a good low end, good bass, because most of the music that they were catering to focused more on bass. There were other clubs that I played at, especially like on the Hollywood Strip in LA, I guess technically in Hollywood, where those clubs are more focused on rock. They're focused more on live musicians. They don't have a PA that's really set up to deliver big bass. A lot of those places may not even have a stereo PA because they're expecting people to bring in amps, and it's not focused on that, right? So just making sure that you prepare yourself properly so your mix translates well is really important. So with that said, this is the last thing I'll do, and then I'm going to finish up in 3 minutes. These drums came from something I sliced, and I said I wanted to try to make various sounds from that one sample, and I think I've done that. But if I only focused on using the sounds from that sample, then everything would sound pretty weak, right? Nothing would be really reinforced to hit the way that I would like. There's a particular plugin in Ableton Live, and again, conceptually, you can do something like this in other DAWs, but Ableton Live has a particular effect that's called drum bus, which is an audio effect, which is a combination of different effects all in one device. We have overdrive, we have sample reduction, we have, you can add a bass, a sub bass tone, so you can make it sound like there's an 808 in here. There's transient shaping, there's very aggressive compression. All of these things can be useful. Sometimes this can be a bit much, but I think in this case, it might be cool. So let's just look at how we can transform these sliced drums, and that will help me get closer to the sound that I'm trying to achieve. All right, so here we go. Okay, that's a pretty significant difference already. And obviously there's more things that can be done. I don't think that I try to make the entire song just by using samples from this drum loop, but you can, right? And the whole point of this really is that, like, when it comes to producing, when it comes to writing songs, I think that the best ideas come from playful experimentation, not limiting, not limiting your creative path, right? See what you can do with the least amount of resources. Try to do something different in some weird way that people haven't done before, and see where you end up. You know, most of us get inspired by hearing something that we didn't hear before. And that's because someone was willing to do something different and inspire others, right? So don't be afraid to do that, because that's ultimately what we're looking for at Berklee, is people who are willing to challenge themselves and make something that we haven't all heard before. So with that said, I'm done talking. And if there's any questions, feel free to share them in the chat. And let me see if I missed anything here.
Yeah, thank you, Thavius. What a great session. I'm sure many of you have questions. This is time. Feel free to post your questions in the chat. I will get to them one by one. And if you would like to speak, raise your hand and I will call your name. Let's start. Actually, Thavius, we had a question from one of our audience. I'm going to post that in the chat right now.
Okay.
1 sec. Okay, let's do the first question. All right. So we have a question from Gonzalo.
Okay, yeah. So in terms of MIDI controllers and live control, and I see that you have another question as well in terms of sample sources. The main controller that I used for years was just a Launchpad. I like the Launchpad a lot because it's very small, it's very hard to break. It's really easy to MIDI map in various ways. And my thing is that I like to do custom MIDI mapping instead of relying on whatever MIDI remote script comes with that piece of gear. So for example, the APC40 is one where when you plug it in, everything is already mapped. And that can be really useful in some scenarios, but for me, I like to be able to have like a certain effects chain that everything goes through. And I want to have certain knobs and faders always mapped to those effects, no matter what I'm looking at or what's been triggered. So that's the big thing. No matter what sort of controller you use, it's just being able to develop your own custom MIDI mapping so things are just consistent and always make sense. For me, that was the Launchpad. But quite honestly, what I really want now, I don't know why they're so hard to find. Novation makes a controller called the Launch Control XL, which is great. It's just knobs and faders and buttons. And it's set up like an 8-channel mixer. And to me, that would probably be the best thing for just controlling effects and volume. But obviously, that you're not going to use that for playing the song, right? So you got to figure out what's most important for you. As far as favorite sample sources, because I see you got a few questions here in a row. So I sample from all types of stuff. I love to sample from my environment. And, you know, being someone who grew up on like, you know, old hip hop stuff, a lot of the old hip hop that I listened to sampled a lot of older jazz records, right? So, and also my first instrument was the alto saxophone. Alto and tenor sax were my first instrument. And I wanted to be like Grover Washington Jr. So I was into a world of jazz influenced by hip hop, influenced by my own desires to play. And a lot of that music is what I would seek out initially when I was sampling stuff, go into record stores and whatnot. But then at a certain point, it's like, okay, I can't just use blatant samples in my music and I need to be able to like manipulate some stuff or generate my own sounds. So nowadays I have different gear. I have a few different samplers that have built-in microphones. So I can just record stuff from wherever and chop it up. So I'll bang on stuff in my kitchen and rattle keys and beatbox and whatever. Yeah, the world is my sample source, right? So whatever it is. The other thing that I use too, I might as well go ahead and give this a quick shout out. There is something called Black Hole, which is an audio. It's not an application, but it's a way for you to route audio from any application on your computer to another one. So for example, I guess, let me bring up a link real fast. I'll just show it. Let me see, Black Hole. This is something that I've shown to a lot of my students because this gives you many other ways to access sound sources. With that said, if you're sampling stuff, I'm not here to talk about the legalities of sampling. Please be smart. Don't just blatantly rip people off. Don't set yourself up to get sued and act like I told you to do it. All right. So with that said, this is an application. It's not an application. I'm not really sure what you would call it. It's a driver. It's a virtual audio driver. All you have to do is submit your email, and it's not like a spammy sort of thing. But with this, you can set it up so that, you know, your browser can output to Black Hole and Ableton Live can receive audio from Black Hole, and then you can record anything from your browser. So I've done that to record stuff from like, what is it? There's a government archive of like public domain speeches and stuff like that. There's a lot of like royalty-free stuff that you can find online that's not Splice, you know, that can be pretty interesting. There's a bunch of stuff that just went into the public domain this year. I think Sherlock Holmes is now in the public domain. So point being, there's samples and stuff that you can use without getting sued if you're going that route. But sampling from your environment and just recording what's around you, to me, is a good way to go. So let me see. How's your process when being asked to write specific songs, pieces for others? That's another good question. So I think it's good to let your ego kind of like, not get in the way of understanding what the ultimate goal is. Like if you're doing something for somebody else, your goal is to make them look good, right? Your goal is to make them shine. Your goal is to support them in any particular way that's going to help them be showcased, right? So the idea really is to make sure that you're not being, at least for me, that I'm not doing anything that's going to be too busy, too flashy, too showy, that's going to contradict the vibe or the energy of what the person I'm working with is going for. And making sure that it's a collaborative process, that I'm not just like dictating what's happening. And also too, it depends, because like, there's situations that I've been brought into where I'm not there to give input. And I know that, right? Like I'm a hired hand. A good example is when I worked with Skylar Grey. I worked with her for like a year, and she found me online. She wanted someone to help her with some Ableton stuff. Her and her manager saw me and were like, okay, you look really cool. We should bring you on the road, And from there, I ended up being her one-man band for like a year. And with a lot of that stuff, they didn't want my input like that, because she was doing her thing with Interscope. It was her major label debut. She's already written all these hit songs for people. They've assumed like, she already had her thing figured out, right? So my role is to just do what's being asked and nothing more, right? In other situations, working with Saul Williams and different artists, it's very much a collaborative process. So making sure that there's input that I can give that's valid, that's relevant, that I'm paying attention, that's really important, So get in where you fit in, ultimately, right? Read the room, understand the situation, know what you're there for, and understand that like if people appreciate what you do, they'll ask you to do more stuff. Like you don't have to be thirsty in a situation trying to do extra stuff, trying to get like, bonus points, because most people don't really appreciate that. Like if you're in a collaborative situation, do what you're there for, do your role to the best of your ability, but don't be flashy and showy, right? Yeah, I don't know. So hopefully that answers the question. Were there any other questions that I missed? Or?
Nope, that's it. Do we have any other questions? We have a couple minutes. Don't be shy. This is the time.
Take advantage while the coffee's working. So Gonzalo, thank you very much for asking questions. And yeah, for all of you that are here in attendance, hopefully you've gotten something worthwhile from this. And yeah, hopefully you're inspired and creative juices are flowing, and you're going to log off and go make some music. So.
All right, then. So lastly, I want to post some contact information. So feel free to save the link. You have additional questions, you know how to reach out to us. This page has all the information about Berklee. And if you're interested in applying, you can find all the information here. And if you're applying for the fall 2023 semester, the next deadline is tomorrow, January 15th. So TikTok, time is up. All right. Thank you so much, Thavius. What a great session. And thank you everyone for joining us. And save the link. Feel free to reach out to us if you have additional questions, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Have a great one.
Bye.
Bye.